You don't look at him. You bow. Even if you are his servant, even if you are his daughter, even if you are his wife, you bow, because to raise your eyes is to challenge the sun. That's what they call him, the living Horus, Lord of the two lands, Father of all. But under the gold, under the paint and ceremony, he is still a man, with flesh, with need, with breath that smells of wine. And the man is named Rameses. He does not age the way others do, not because his skin does not wrinkle. It does. Not because his teeth do not rot. They do. But because no one is allowed to say so. He has ruled for decades. He will rule for more. He is both beginning and end. And inside the palace, no one forgets it. The columns are carved with his victories, the doorways inscribed with his divine birth, even the ceilings painted to show the stars bowing down to his name. He eats alone, or with those he calls gods. He sleeps in rooms perfumed with incense, draped in linen finer than breath. And when he walks, the marble echoes like thunder. But there are cracks, not in the walls, in the silence. The priests say he was born of Ra, but servants whisper he was born of ambition. They say he conquered the Hittites, but the scribes know the treaty was forged in desperation. They say he built cities, but they were built with backs, with blood, with children too small to carry stones but big enough to die in the sun. Still, he is Pharaoh. To question him is to blaspheme. To resist is to vanish. Even his family bows. Even his sons, grown men with wives of their own, lower their eyes when he enters. Even his wives, queens in name, stand like statues unmoving, waiting to be dismissed. And his daughters? They kneel, because they were not born for joy. They were born for lineage. Rameses doesn't see them as children. He sees them as symbols, as vessels. He watches how they walk, how they hold their gaze, how they move when music begins, not with affection, with calculation, because his blood is sacred, and sacred blood must be kept pure. This is Egypt, not Greece, not Rome. Here, the gods marry their sisters. Here, Isis is both wife and sibling to Osiris. Here, the divine does not separate family from flesh. So why should he? In his court, no one asks questions. They write what they're told. They carve what they are ordered. The god-king's reality becomes law, and the law becomes scripture. But somewhere behind the incense, behind the walls humming with chants and the sandals clicking against limestone, there is still a girl. Not yet 10, not yet bleeding. She's dressed in silk that weighs more than she does. Her arms are painted with coal, her lips tinted with crushed beetle paste. She does not speak. She does not blink. She is taught to walk slowly, to bow deeply, to smile when asked. She has a name, but it will be reshaped, because she is the daughter of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is no father. Pharaoh is the son. Pharaoh is the law. Pharaoh is the god in human skin. And gods do not love. They take. She was born in a palace, but not to be free. No girl in the house of Rameses was ever born for herself, not even the queens. Nefertari, his great royal wife, was called beloved of the gods. Her name is written in golden ink. Her tomb, one of the most beautiful ever built, lies deep in the Valley of the Queens. Its walls glow with prayers and painted hymns. But even she knew. She was not chosen for love. She was chosen for power. She bore sons. She bore daughters. She stood beside him in statues. And then, one day, she vanished. Her name stops appearing in temple inscriptions. Her face fades from the reliefs, and the next queen rises, Izet Nofret. Same title, same function, another womb for the dynasty, because Rameses had dozens of wives, not one out of love, all out of need, and his daughters? They were prepared to take those places too, not as children, as queens. Because in ancient Egypt, royalty did not look outside itself for marriage. That would dilute the bloodline, break the line between man and God. To keep the divine pure, they kept the circle tight. father to daughter, brother to sister, cousin to cousin. It wasn't a scandal, it was structured. Sacred order, the mirror of the gods. Osiris married Isis, Shu paired with Tefnut. Divinity came in twos, and those two were always kin. The gods didn't ask permission, neither did Pharaoh. Inside the palace, young girls were dressed for state dinners, not to eat, but to be seen. Their bodies draped in white linen, their hair coiled in braids soaked with oil. Gold bands circled their arms before they understood what they meant. They were taught languages, but not how to speak their mind. They were taught to dance, but never where to walk. They were taught music, but never how to ask for silence. Everything about them was decoration, preparation. By the age of 10, some were already titled Ornament of the King. By 12, One who sings to the Lord. By 14, Wife of the Pharaoh. These weren't metaphors, they were positions, lifelong roles. Daughters were lined up during festivals, seated behind their father's throne, praised not for their thoughts, but for their stillness. Foreign dignitaries watched, eyes darting from the young queens to the older ones, trying to tell who was mother, who was child, who was both. Sometimes there was no answer, because the court didn't want them to know, because clarity would have meant admitting what was being done. And the girls themselves, they didn't ask. They were told they were holy. They were told they were chosen. They were told that the gods had kissed their foreheads, blessed their bodies, ordained their silence. They smiled. They bowed. They did not run, because there was nowhere to run. Beyond the palace were deserts. Beyond the deserts, war. Beyond war, men who would treat them worse. So they stayed. And Rameses kept building. Temples with his face 10 stories high. Obelisks carved with his name thousands of times. Chambers filled with statues of daughters, not as children, but as queens. Regal, eternal, silent. Not one showed a girl laughing. Not one showed a girl crying. Not one showed a girl turning away. Because the myth of god-kings required mythic daughters, and that myth did not allow for escape. They lined the temple walls, always behind him, never beside, never ahead. Their names were carved in soft curves, elegant script, Bintanath, Meritamen, Nebetawi, Henutawi, daughters of Pharaoh, wives of Pharaoh. Their titles shimmered in stone, written with reverence. She who is greatly praised. God's wife of Amun, king's great wife. You read them and wonder, how many women did he marry? And then you look closer. You realize those names are the same names from the nursery. They were not foreign princesses, not daughters of generals, not gifts from foreign kings. They were his own daughters, and he gave them crowns. But not for glory, not for love. He gave them crowns because they were his blood. In Egypt, blood was everything. It was sacred, circular, closed. If your veins carried the fire of Ra, you could not share that fire with outsiders. So Rameses kept it inside the family, tight, controlled, and hidden under gold. His daughters became queens not in youth, but in ritual. There were ceremonies, staged like weddings, but quieter. No flowers, no drums, just priests, incense, eyes cast down. A girl stood before her father. He placed the uraeus, the serpent diadem, on her head. The people cheered, but they did not smile, because everyone knew what it meant. She would serve beside him. She would sleep near him. She would carry his child if she could, and no one would write that part. Not clearly. No papyrus scroll ever said, Pharaoh slept with his daughter. Instead it said, she was favoured. She stood at his right hand. She bore the lineage. But if you read between the lines, if you trace the dates, the titles, the way names shift from daughter to wife, wife to mother, you see the truth. You see Bintanath, eldest of his known daughters, titled Great Royal Wife in midlife. You see inscriptions where she stands alone, her father gone, but her status unchanged. still queen, still honoured, still mother, and you wonder, of whom? The child's name is never given. The boy is only called born of the great wife, and that silence screams, because even in a society where sibling marriage was sacred, father-daughter union was something else, not forbidden, not illegal, but unspeakable. The records do not deny it. They simply look away. And that tells you more than any scroll ever could. Inside the palace, the girls were queens, but queens without freedom. They could not marry without permission. They could not leave the royal court. They could not speak above a whisper. They were seen. They were dressed. They were blessed, but they were not heard. Their faces, painted with ochre lined with gold, appear on tomb walls, statues, stelae, but always in profile, always still, always waiting. No laughter, no motion, no rebellion, because a Pharaoh's daughter belonged to the gods, and in Egypt the gods took what they wanted, even if it meant taking their own. The people bowed, the priests gave blessings, the scribes recorded it as holy, and the daughters, they obeyed. Because to say no to Pharaoh was to say no to the sun, and no one survives that. It looked like any royal wedding. Trumpets blared from the temple gates. Incense thickened the air. Crowds gathered behind guards, craning their necks to glimpse the golden bark that carried her. The bride wore white linen, layered and perfumed. Her jewellery shimmered, lapis, turquoise, polished carnelian. Her hair, plaited into 100 braids, had been oiled for hours. She kept her head high, but her eyes did not rise, because this was no ordinary wedding. This was Binternath, daughter of Rameses II, and the man waiting for her at the altar, beneath the canopy of gilded lotus petals, was her father. They didn't call it incest. They called it divine union. They said it honoured the gods. They said Isis had married Osiris, and that the royal house must reflect heaven. But no gods bled. No gods gave birth. She walked toward him like a statue, measured, balanced, unshaking. The priests chanted blessings. The scribes wrote fast, not missing a single word. But none of them wrote what the people were thinking. They watched and whispered, but not too loudly, because to question Pharaoh was to question the sun. And who would dare speak against the sun? In the great hall of Luxor, beneath walls carved with battles and glories, Binternath became queen, not just by blood, but by ceremony. They placed the uraeus on her forehead, a serpent's breath, a sign of dominion. They painted her lips with crushed pomegranate. They gave her the title, Great Royal Wife. The crowd cheered, but not because they believed, because they were told to. And her? She smiled the way she was taught to smile, lips soft, eyes down, still. No tears, no trembling, because that would dishonour him, and in this world, his honour was her burden. That night, torches lit the stone corridors. Perfume smoke drifted through the chamber doors. Musicians played harp and flute just outside, their melody thin, trembling. No one knows what happened behind the curtain. No scrolls describe it. No priests recorded the ritual. But 9 moons later, there was a child. His name was never spoken. He was never given the title Prince, only son of the great wife. He was educated, dressed in gold, trained in court ritual. But he never sat on the throne, because even Pharaoh knew what he had done. Even the gods went silent on this child's behalf. Some say he died young. Others say he was hidden, raised by priests, buried without inscription. Because this wedding, this union, had gone too far even for Egypt. They could justify brother-sister marriage. They could justify divine bloodlines. But a father wedding his own daughter, that was a mirror held too close, too clear. So the story was rewritten. Binternath's name appears in tombs, still titled Great Royal Wife. But the marriage disappears from speech. The child disappears from history. And Rameses, he builds more statues, more temples, more images of himself that stretched 10 stories high, as if height could erase guilt, as if stone could silence the past. But if you look close, if you walk the ruins of Luxor, of Karnak, of Abu Simbel, you'll see her, Bintaneth, frozen in stone beside him, a queen, a daughter, a vessel, crowned in gold, bound by blood, and married to a god who forgot he was a man. They called it a palace, but it felt more like a mausoleum. Long halls echoing with silence, stone rooms dressed in linen and perfume but no warmth, servants who walked barefoot so their steps made no sound, and in the centre of it all, Rameses, a god in mortal skin, surrounded by wives, daughters, sons, and yet utterly alone, because something was missing. Not gold, not food, not legacy. Mothers. The palace had many women, but few stayed long enough to be remembered. Fewer still became anything more than names and tomb walls. Even Nefertari, his most beloved, disappears early. Her tomb is a masterpiece. But after her death, her voice vanishes. No letters, no words, no echo of her thoughts, just silence. Isetnofret, the second queen, mother of powerful sons, receives statues, inscriptions, and then she too is gone. It's not that they died quickly, it's that once they ceased to be useful, they ceased to be visible, because women in the palace were not remembered for who they were, only for what they gave. Sons, obedience, beauty. They were mothers, yes, but only in function. Their voices weren't recorded. Their fears weren't carved. Their grief wasn't sung. Only Pharaoh's triumphs filled the scrolls. The women became the background. Daughters were elevated but not protected. Wives were honoured but not cherished. Concubines passed through like mist, leaving only children behind. Even queens, those with titles and crowns, lived in the shadows. They had chambers but not freedom, gifts but not choices, devotion but not love. And when they disappeared, no one asked why. Their children grew up without them. The young princes were raised by tutors, not mothers. The princesses were groomed by priestesses, not nurtured by hands that had once soothed them. A daughter's tears dried before anyone saw them. A son's rage turned inward, swallowed in marble halls, because emotions made you human, and in the house of gods, humanity was dangerous. Rameses ruled longer than any pharaoh before him. He outlived many of his sons. He replaced wives like tiles in a mosaic, and yet his court grew colder with each passing year. No lullabies echoed through the nursery halls, no women laughed in the gardens, no arms opened with comfort. There were titles: God's wife, sweet of voice, mistress of all lands. But there were no mothers, only wombs that served the dynasty, only bodies that birthed heirs, only names etched next to Ramesses on the stone, then never spoken again. And the children left behind. They learned to perform, to bow at the right time, to stand still during processions, to smile when crowned, even if they were afraid. But they didn't learn how to grieve. They didn't learn how to love, because no one taught them. The palace raised kings, not men. It raised queens, not daughters. And the one thing it could not give, warmth, was the thing it stripped from every corner. So the palace stood, brilliant in gold, drenched in silence. And beneath its polished surface it rotted, motherless, joyless, hollow. The bloodline should have been everything. In ancient Egypt, lineage was more than memory, it was power. It legitimized thrones. It connected kings to gods. It made empires feel eternal. But for all his children, over 100, maybe more, Rameses left behind a silence that cannot be explained, especially when it came to his grandchildren. Their names should have filled temple walls. They should have been carved into obelisks. They should have been honoured, son of the son of the sun. Instead, they vanish. Or worse, they appear only in fragments, half-phrases, titles with no lineage. Child of the great wife. Heir of the house. But whose child? Whose house? The answer lies in the silence, and in what that silence tried to erase. Because if Binternath bore Rameses a child, if the king truly fathered his own grandchild, then every inscription that followed became dangerous. How do you glorify a son born of incest without reminding the world of the father's crime? You don't. You blur the lines. You write titles instead of names. You show the child at court but never on the throne. You hint but never confirm. And in doing so, you erase not just the boy's future, you erase his existence. Some grandchildren of Rameses are known, barely. One son of Binternath may have existed. Some scholars point to fragments of stelae, tombs half destroyed, names worn smooth by wind and time, but none of them were crowned, none of them ruled, because even Pharaoh's glory couldn't clean what happened in his house. Even in a kingdom that worshipped divine incest, there were limits. There were things you did not say aloud, and so they were silenced. Not just the grandchildren, the daughters who bore them, the scribes who documented them, the priests who blessed them, all went quiet. Instead, the monuments show Rameses alone, Rameses in battle, Rameses with gods, Rameses with sons, never grandsons. You walk through his temples and you're swallowed by the repetition. His name, inscribed over 5,000 times at Karnak alone. His face, enlarged, idealized, never aging. But behind him, no future, just blank space. A dynasty swollen with children, and yet, no clear line forward. By the time of his death, most of his sons had already died. Many had been forgotten, and the grandchildren, nameless, faceless, buried in unmarked tombs, if at all. It was not an accident, it was a choice. Because pharaohs controlled not just the living but the story of the dead, and Rameses, the master of myth, of spectacle, of eternal legacy, knew what to hide. He could not allow Egypt to see the cracks in his godhood. The child born of a daughter, the bloodline that folded back on itself. So he carved everything in stone, except them, the children of daughters. The grandchildren were born of queens who were also sisters. The futures never allowed to begin, they were erased, and Egypt, in all its splendour, pretended they never existed. By the time Rameses died, no one was sure where his body ended and his legend began. He had ruled for 66 years. He had outlived most of his sons. He had buried queens, wives, daughters, some more than once, in title if not in name. His face had been carved into every city. His image stretched across temples, tombs, and mountains. The world bowed to him. And yet, in the end, he stood alone. Not because there were no heirs, but because none could stand beside what he had become. He had taken everything. He had married his daughters. He had buried his sons. He had fathered children whose names could never be spoken. He had consumed his own bloodline, not out of cruelty, out of need. Because power, in its rawest form, is hungry, and Rameses fed it with flesh, with legacy, with family. His final years were not spent in joy or peace. They were surrounded by ghosts, not literal spirits, but memory, etched into walls, floating through the palace corridors, servants who bowed lower each year, priests who dared not speak his age, scribes who recorded victories long after the battles had stopped. The sons who remained no longer challenged him. They waited, silently, for a throne that had turned to stone. When he died, they embalmed him as a god. They wrapped him in linen soaked in oil. They placed a golden mask over his face, perfect, unwrinkled. They laid him in a tomb built for eternity. But even there, the silence followed. Because what Rameses left behind wasn't a dynasty. It was a void, a family tree that looped in on itself until it collapsed. A court full of unnamed children, blurred bloodlines, forgotten mothers, a house without laughter, without mourning, without love. His statues still stand, colossal, imposing, unbreakable. But walk past them, look at the base, You won't find many names, not daughters, not of grandchildren, not of the women who bore his line and were never allowed to speak. You'll find titles, honorifics, but not memory, because Rameses ruled like a god, and gods, in the end, do not build futures. They demand sacrifices. He didn't pass the torch. He burned it, in gold, in silence, in blood. And Egypt, for all its reverence, for all its stone and scrolls and sacred myths, never truly recovered. What he built with such force unravelled slowly, like linen fraying in the dark. Because when a man devours his own line to preserve his throne, what he leaves behind isn't immortality. It's ruined wearing a crown.